In this segment, I will show you how to prepare the muslin and to cut it out before assembling the skirt for a fitting. I want to measure the entire length, so if you see the waist where my right hand is, it curves up. So you have to go from the lowest point of the hem to the highest part of the waistline to measure the length of fabric that you will need. So first, next to the selvage, but inside the selvage, I put an arrow, and that will remind me later on that that is the length grain in case I get confused. Tear the selvage off. Remember that the selvage will bind the edges and make the fabric tight at that area. So by snipping and tearing the selvage off, the fabric releases and you're able to block the fabric properly. I like to first iron and steam out all of the wrinkles, especially around the corners, or not the edges, because it rolls up when you tear it. The fabric's actually a little wider than I need, so I want to orient the pattern onto the fabric to see if there's enough excess muslin to trim it a little bit. It's just the smaller or more to the size of the pattern piece that you use, the more efficient it is. So I can cut this little bit off. So snip and tear so it's on grain. Again, press it so that it's flat and not curled at the edges. And remember, when fabric is put on a roll, it often gets a little distorted. So that's the reason to block the fabric. It helps pull it back onto perfect grain. So I'm folding, and it doesn't matter which direction you fold it. Put the edges together. And steam it. Because I'm cutting 2 layers, it doesn't matter if I create a crease in this on the fold, so I'm just going to press the whole piece. This wasn't hard to block, but remember, when you fold the fabric, if one corner seems very short, take that corner and its diagonal opposite and pull. That will stretch it back into shape. We'll put this one aside for a moment. And repeating the same process for this piece. This is a pretty large pattern. The skirt's pretty wide at the bottom, so it takes quite a bit of fabric. You can see it's a little off, so that'll get pulled back into shape. Going back to the first piece of muslin, at the center crease, and with my red pencil, I'm making a center line. This is, of course, on the length grain. In other words, the length grain is horizontal to the screen. I'm putting pins on the horizontal grain line, and then I'll transfer those pins. Just push them right through the paper, and this will help me create the cross grain on the fabric. I'm measuring from one edge to from the right edge of the fabric to the grain line, pulling the fabric a little bit more into a straight line, and again the same measurement from the edge of the fabric on the right to the grain line. Making a dot with a pencil, and then I'll align all of those with a ruler and create a drawn cross grain. It's easy to just use the L-shaped ruler, but if you've not also used measurements, the L-shaped ruler is not necessarily accurate. That's why I measure from the edge of the fabric to where I want that cross grain to be, all up and down the piece of fabric and then align it with the ruler. Now that pencil line is parallel to the right edge of the fabric. I'm going to fold on the length grain center back line that's drawn in red. Put a pen through the cross grain to make sure it lines up completely across the width of the hip area that I will be using for the skirt pattern. This stabilizes the fabric before I lay the pattern on top of it. Now, I did create a full pattern so that when I cut the linen cotton fabric that's made for the skirt, I can use the whole pattern. But for the muslin, this is nicely blocked and it will be much easier to cut it on the fold. So I'm lining up the pattern center back line perfectly against the fold line of the fabric, and also lining up the cross grain of the pattern directly on top of the cross grain drawn onto the muslin. Writing seam allowance in, that clearly I forgot to do the first time when I was making the pattern. Snipping the notches. Center back notch, and just a tiny little snip, not more than 1/4 of an inch. Writing the seam allowances on the muslin, just easier to reference these if they're written down, so if I forget what I'm doing, they're right there in front of me. And now to prepare the muslin for the front skirt pattern. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, I cut this piece a little shorter than needed, but it really should not be a problem because it's just the seam allowance and hem. Although when it gets to the fashion fabric, I'll have to check that very carefully. I'm transferring the markings, the fold lines, center front lines, to the muslin. Now this cross grain, I didn't measure from the edge of the fabric, I'm just drawing it. And I can see at the bottom right hand corner, I really should have stretched that fabric a little bit more because it's bowed a little bit. You can see that it's not completely perpendicular to the bottom edge of the fabric. It bows out a little bit on the right hand side. This skirt is not a soft drapey skirt, so that really shouldn't be a problem. However, it's something to consider going forward. And the reason I'm cutting this single layer is because of that little corner at the hem where my scissors are at this moment. I can flip the fabric around, and if I cut them individually, there'll be plenty of fabric. If I cut it with the fabric folded, I'd have a little V cut off. Snipping notches as I go. And I'm remembering that the second front that I'm preparing now has to be a mirror image of the first. So turning the pattern basically with the printed side down, snipping the notches. And now to cut a muslin for the waistband and the pockets. Marking the length grain. Cutting a waistband on the length grain provides a certain stability that the cross grain does not. There are times I want to cut a waistband on the cross grain, especially if there's a pattern in the skirt I'm trying to match, or any garment. But the cross grain has a little more give. It actually stretches a little bit more than the length grain. So that's why you have more stability if you can cut the waistband on the length grain. Because this piece of muslin was torn, it is on perfect grain. It might have needed blocking. This one looks fine. But when you tear fabric, it tears right on grain. And because it tears on grain, now I can align the edge of the pattern piece against the torn and pressed edge. Snipping the notches. And transferring the markings from the paper pattern to the muslin. I'm folding where the notches are, that way I can tell where that side seam is. Just folding, creasing right between both notches, lining my ruler up and drawing a line. The same thing at the center front and the seam allowance. I'd clipped the notches, so I'm just aligning them with my ruler and connecting them with a drawn line. And this will help me attach the muslin waistband to the skirt muslin. Again, just aligning the little tiny snips at top and bottom, using my ruler to line them up and drawing a line to connect them. So I've indicated seam allowance, center front, side seams, and center back. folding across the top of the waistband fold line, steaming it. I always steam these creases before I apply the waistband to the garment. When you watch me actually work with the fashion fabrics, you'll see me do the same thing. If you put a waistband on a skirt and then try to crease it, it's not as accurate. It's much better to crease it before you sew it to the skirt. And then pin these pieces together. It's so easy to think that's a little scrap and toss it away, which I've certainly done before. And now to cut pockets. Marking length grain. Making a grain line, taking pins to put straight through and transfer it to the other side. And now to press under the seam allowances on the pockets. I'll deal with the curved seam allowance later. Now, to fold along the fold lines on the front skirt pieces. This is the fold line closest to the center front that you will see when the skirt is made. And then folding it in creates its own interfacing. Hopefully this little part right here will help you understand why I patterned the front of the skirt the way I did. This way you don't have to apply an additional piece of fabric to interface it. In this final fold, you can see it's wide enough for the buttons and an extension. And again, when I start to work with the fashion fabric and sew the final skirt, all of this will come together. You can see that this fold, the edge of the fabric below the fold, meets the first fold that I did. So the entire facing is interfaced with its own fabric. So now I have two fronts, and I'm overlapping them so that the center front lines are on top of each other, and the center front line is where the buttons and buttonholes go. Center front right there, 5/8 of an inch from the edge. And you can see through the fabric well enough to see that there's a nice amount with the facing plus the interfacing.